Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I am honored to be participating in a big group project to read all the novels of Toni Morrison in chronological order over the course of 2020. I'll link to the announcement video below. Because of the interruption in many of our reading lives, we made the decision to delay our schedule by a month. Therefore, our April book was Morrison's third novel, Song of Solomon, despite the fact that this video is not happening until, the second half of May. Our actual May book is Tar Baby. If you'd like to join us, please do. All are welcome, even if you just want to join for one or two books. During the plague, I've read a lot of nonfiction, but no fiction at all until I started Song of Solomon. And it took me longer than usual to be fully committed to the novel. Not Morrison's fault at all, just the way this global crisis has affected me. But once I committed, I was just blown away. I've mentioned before that as a younger person, I had read The Bluest Eyes, Sula, Beloved, and a couple of other Morrison novels, but not her classic Song of Solomon. Now that I've finished it and spent some time thinking about it, I almost want to go right back and read it again, this time paying attention to the ways the earliest chapters set up the rest of the book. The story is one that circles around and around, exploring ideas of flight and song, family and life and death, all against a backdrop of the experience of violence and oppression. To be honest, I had kind of avoided this book, mostly because I'd heard that it was an example of magical realism. Although I've definitely enjoyed some books that use magical realism, I have to be in the right mood. And the idea of being in the right mood for Morrison and also the right mood for really significant magical realism never seemed to strike. But I'm going to argue that this book, like some of her other books, is in fact not magical realism exactly. Yes, things that seem impossible do happen, but in the same kinds of metaphoric or symbolic ways that they do in other Morrison novels like Sula and Beloved, and in some other important contemporary African American fiction. Perhaps that's exactly what magical realism usually means. Certainly here in Song of Solomon, those elements of impossible feel like they are more than magical and more than just metaphoric. They give this book a sense of being mythological. Morrison quite deliberately situates her book in the world of mythology and the world of origin stories. To begin with, the narrative is absolutely saturated with biblical allusions to characters and images and stories. There are a lot of other myths and deep stories alluded to in this book too. Homer's Odyssey and assorted Greek myths get not only referenced but developed. So does Shakespeare, at least in my reading. Crucially, Morrison also steps beyond these master narratives of the Western canon to the storytelling and myth-making passed down through generations of enslaved people and their descendants in the United States, and probably rooted in West African traditions. More on all that, including my personal connection, in a minute. Song of Solomon is, of course, named after a book in the Bible called The Song of Solomon. If you're not a Bible reader and you haven't read the story, it might come as a surprise. It's an account of a young woman and her love, their desire for each other, and PG details of their erotic behavior. There is no direct link to theological content in this story, although religious readers often suggest that the text is referring to the love between God and God's people. At the very least, this is a book that treads a line between sacred love and secular or sexual love. If we read it that way, it braids together two things that are often kept quite separate. Perhaps in a parallel way, Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon braids together two things often kept separate: the traditional mythology of the masters and the traditional mythology of the enslaved. This novel features Milkman Dead as the protagonist, Morrison's first attempt at having a man as her main character. Although to me he's the one who grows and changes in the course of the book, and therefore the protagonist, Morrison populates the book with a variety of female characters whose stories and perspectives help the reader understand Milkman Dead's world in a way he doesn't have the ability to access. There are a lot of angles to this story, but I'm going to focus on Milkman's quest here for a second. He starts out by searching for treasure, lost gold that he thought his family had acquired. But during his search for this familial golden fleece, his search turns into one far more meaningful, a quest for family history, for family culture, for stories. Milkman travels south in his search, and for him, it's a trip down not only in latitude, but almost in time, too. Morrison portrays the South as a place where history has remained far more static, unerased by the development which had happened in the North. By the end of the book, Milkman has found a way forward, and on the last page, we're right there with him on the precipice of his next step. As I said, there are a lot of allusions to literature and folk stories throughout the book. Biblical references, particularly names, are perhaps the most obvious. In Milkman's circle are Ruth, a woman who, like the biblical character, takes another family as her own, Rebecca, 1 Corinthians, Hagar, and Pilate, as in Pontius Pilate. The use of all these names infuses the story with biblical weight and often echoes some of the main characteristics of the characters. The story of the biblical Hagar is sort of a first edition Handmaid's Tale, and Morrison's Hagar echoes that story of a woman abused by the system of patriarchy. Interestingly, Pilate's name seems to me to have more to do with its homonym, pilot, as in the verb to steer or lead, or the noun for the person who steers and leads. Pilate first has to steer herself. She's born after her mother dies. And to symbolize that she had no mother, she has no navel, nothing to show evidence that she was mothered. But she finds a way forward, and she eventually helps other people find ways forward. Morrison uses the name Circe for a woman living in a lush landscape surrounded by wolf-like dogs, a woman who sets Milkman on his odyssey to travel down, not to the underworld here as Odysseus travels, but to the south, to the past, to the root. As he travels, he often travels through water. Many of the episodes he lives through seem like iterations of Homer's epic, or perhaps versions of Dante's Descent. At other moments, though, we seem to be getting allusions to Shakespeare. One of Morrison's scenes is reminiscent of Hamlet's ghost speaking to his child. At other moments, Hagar seems more like Ophelia than she does like her biblical namesake, going mad when rejected by her lover. Even the end of the novel resonates with the end of Hamlet in certain ways. Of course, in addition to these allusions to classic Western literature is Morrison's use of traditional folk tale or myth, collected over and over in the interviews with former slaves made during the 1930s as part of the federal government's program to support writers and scholars and artists during the Great Depression. The main tale Morrison uses is the story of flying Africans, of enslaved people finding escape from slavery by flying home. Where is that home, and how are they escaping bondage? Is it a flight back to Africa? Is it suicide? Either way, it's a kind of transcendence in a world full of horrors in a certain kind of way. Morrison is intent on making us walk that line, and classic Western literature helps her do it too. When we hear stories of the search for a body left in a wild cave, do we think about the ancient Greek stories of men not given proper burial? Or do we think of the Easter story, the New Testament story of the body of Jesus no longer in the tomb? I first learned about the stories of flying Africans as a young person, growing up on the coast of the Carolinas. My father, a social historian who studied slave culture in that area, and who eventually wrote an introduction to Drums and Shadows, a collection of those interviews with former slaves. These interviews show how much cultural continuity taught through storytelling and other folk culture can be a form of resistance, a fact that Morrison clearly sees herself. When Milkman hears the song, a song which circles throughout the novel and becomes quite a literal version of the Song of Solomon by the end, he starts to feel that kind of cultural connection, or that family connection, in a way that had never made sense to him before. I'm reluctant to say much about the plot, partly because it's a tangled web that we are not meant to completely untie, I think, and partly because I want you to discover it yourself. But I will say that Morrison has great compassion for her characters, just as she does in both The Bluest Eye and Sula, her first and second novels. In this, her third novel, she shows us flawed and dislikable characters at one moment, and then turns the perspectives so that we start to understand that character with far more sympathy and even identification. All right, now that I'm already late picking up May's pick for Toni Morrison 2020, her fourth novel, Tar Baby, I should get cracking. Thanks for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.